This is Duke University.
Thank you for joining our webinar, which focuses on understanding the EPA's Clean Power Plan. Today's webinar is one of several that Duke University's Nichols Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions will host in 2015. Each webinar gives participants the opportunity to interact with our researchers as they discuss work across our 6 programs and its impact on environmental policy. The Nichols Institute has provided decision makers in the public and private sectors unbiased evaluations of policy risks and rewards that have led to a host of interdisciplinary environmental solutions in our first decade. One such example is our work recognizing the potential of the Clean Air Act to address climate change with practical regulatory strategies to limit greenhouse gas emissions. In a moment, Tim Profeta, Director of the Nichols Institute, Jonas Monist, Director of the Climate and Energy Program, Brian Murray, Director of our Environmental Economics Program, will discuss how the Section 111D performance standards will affect the electricity sector and what elements to look for when the final rule is released this summer. Following their presentation, our speakers will take questions which can be entered in the chat window to the right of your screen anytime. Tim?
Thank you, Erin, and welcome everybody. I want to give a little preview of what we're hoping to do here. We're probably going to talk for maybe 25 minutes or so. Myself and my 2 colleagues, Jonas Monist and Brian Murray. I'm going to provide a little background on our involvement on the issue at the Institute. I'm going to ask Jonas to sort of put the Clean Power Plan in context of the larger conversations and trends that are going on in the country and in the energy sector. And then Jonas and Brian will also look at some of the big issues and the analysis and options that we've been looking at in some of our work on the Clean Power Plan. Again, please send along questions as you have them, and we will try and leave at least the back half of this webinar to be able to field and answer those questions. Just so you know, a word on the Nichols Institute. I was a founding director of the Nichols Institute now 10 years ago, and we are doing a series that look at some of the big issues and questions that we've worked upon and believe we had some impact upon. I do want to stress, however, that the way that the Institute works, we are a bridge between the intellectual expertise of Duke University and policymakers, and we work in a way that does not advocate any position whatsoever, but simply tries to engage those policymakers and bring the resources to the university to bear to help them make the value judgments that they need to make in a better informed manner. One issue that the Nichols Institute over its years has worked on quite robustly has been the issue of climate change policy and addressing greenhouse gas emissions in both the United States and globally. The issue in the first 5 years of the Nichols Institute was primarily centered on a debate in the U.S. Congress, but we began to turn to the issue of the Clean Air Act and how it related to greenhouse gases as long ago as 6 years ago in 2009, as we saw the legislative debate wind its way down to a non-conclusion. And came to the realization that the Clean Air Act was truly going to be triggered. We've done a number of different types of workshops and research approaches to the question. I would characterize it in sort of 3 phases. We began in 2009 with simply a legal evaluation of what the options were under the Act and how to do, how could the EPA attack greenhouse gas emissions under the Act in a way that would be the least inefficient and most effective. Jonas and I co-authored a paper we titled Avoiding the Glorious Mess to try and put out some of those concepts, thinking that many, including John Dingell, had hypothesized that regulating under the Clean Air Act would be a glorious mess, and that there might be some ways that the Act could be deployed that would not be as inefficient as was being forecast. One of those provisions and ideas that was in that paper was the idea that Section 111D would be a mechanism and an authority to use to regulate greenhouse gases under the Act. And once it was announced that that would be the approach that the agency took, we went to a second phase, I think, of a really exploration of with a broad stakeholder community as to what should that look like. We did multiple workshops on those ideas, or open to the public with multiple stakeholders, and really tried to sort of narrow in on the ideas of how Section 111D should be utilized. Then the third phase would be the phase that I would characterize right now, was the phase once the agency started moving towards and then offering a proposed rule. We've worked a lot with the intended recipients of that proposal, the state and the state leaders who are going to be charged with devising state implementation plans to regulate greenhouse gases if the rule goes if and when the rule goes finals. For that community, we have run multiple workshops in multiple regions of the country. In doing so, we are not trying to negotiate anything else between them. We are not trying to put together a regional approach. What we're really trying to do is provide the analysis, legal, economic, that allows those officials to evaluate their options under the Act, and have taken their lead to many questions that they would like to be evaluated as to how to most effectively deploy their state authorities in the Act. That has led us into conversations about comparing regional approaches to state-specific approaches and different ways that flexibility can be brought into the regulatory system. You know, it's key for me just to stress that we're not bringing any ideas to the officials, but we're really devising ideas that they have targeted us to from their own considerations. And that'll include many of the policies that you may be hearing from my colleagues today. Then I would finally say that we're beginning to enter into another period, I guess, in my definition, a fourth period of this conversation. This is really the conversation that is anticipating the final rule, and then will be really triggered by the promulgation of a final rule by the agency. And it's I was just at a meeting yesterday with a number of stakeholders where there really is a feeling of there's not much more to do until that rule goes final, and we're able to evaluate the rule and how it has changed and how it would impact all the stakeholders we've been engaging with. It's a interesting political time. I think I would regard in almost all the states there is a two different conversations going on. There's a political conversation that is either expressing some fervent support or opposition to the rule that is coming out of the political leadership of the states, but there's also a very pragmatic regulatory conversation amongst the professional staff who are going to be charged with executing the rule once it comes to the states. Of course, there's also a congressional debate going on about the bill, about the rule at this point in time. There'll be a number of efforts, as everybody knows, to either buttress or more likely in this Congress undercut the agency's ability and resources to execute the rule. But I do believe that there's sort of political presumption that the votes will not be there to actually slow the train, and so that hence underlying the pragmatic approach that we see in a lot of the state governments. But mostly, I would say most of the stakeholders we're engaged with are evaluating their political strategy after the final rule is introduced, and what they will do and how they will engage will really depend on whether their issues were addressed in the interim between the proposal and the final, and where their particular interests and their particular constituencies are left after EPA makes its changes. So with that, I want to turn to Jonas Monist, our Director of Climate and Energy Policy here at the Nichols Institute, to take us further. Jonas?
Great, thanks, Tim. In just a few moments, our colleague Brian Murray is going to talk about some of the key decision points that states and stakeholders are looking at with complying with the upcoming final rule. What I want to do is take a couple of minutes to provide some context for thinking about the implications of the final rule and really understanding both what the EPA is doing and what this may mean for the energy systems within the states that are having to comply with this. So first off, this is all taking place in the context of an electricity system that is transitioning very rapidly, and that transition is due to a number of factors: economic, technological, and regulatory. So on the economic side, I think natural gas and hydraulic fracturing implications there can't be overstated. It's really led to a dramatic change both here in the Southeast and across the country as natural gas prices fell quite rapidly and are projected to stay relatively low for the foreseeable future. On the technological side, just as an example, the cost of solar, similar to natural gas, has fallen very rapidly in recent years, and really more rapidly than many observers anticipated, which is leading utilities to install solar, not just because state renewable portfolio standards are instructing them to increase renewable energy generation, but because it makes economic sense in some states now to increase solar generation. And on the regulatory side, even before we get to limiting CO2 emissions, the recent rules that were enacted to limit mercury emissions through the utility MATS rule and limit downwind transport of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter under the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CSAPR, have also been driving changes in the system. So that leads us, actually one more point, we also have an electricity system that is really manages its multiple grids across the country, 3 large interconnections, one east of the Rockies, one west of the Rockies, and one covering most of Texas. But the fact that we do have regional electricity transmissions is one of the factors that's led states to think about what multi-state compliance means rather than just simply looking at this on a state-by-state basis. So that's some background. The other background that's important to keep in mind as we're moving towards the final version of the Clean Power Plan is that all this is taking place within the context of the Clean Air Act. And I think at this point now there is I think, very broad appreciation for what the EPA has proposed in the Clean Power Plan, but I think maybe less appreciation for how the construct of the Clean Air Act, and really we're talking about here a few paragraphs that have really remained largely unchanged since 1970 when the Congress passed the modern version of the Clean Air Act, how that informs the EPA's choices. First off, very broad statutory language in Section 111D and limited precedent. No direct judicial decisions interpreting what this particular provision of the law means. So it puts the EPA in the position where they're taking this broad statutory language, which presents a number of choices for the agency, and the EPA is making those choices without past guidance from the courts about what some of this language means. We do know the EPA has a role here. The EPA is setting emissions targets for the state. The EPA will also evaluate the state plans, and if the states either don't submit a plan or submit a plan the EPA deems as insufficient, then the EPA will impose a federal plan upon that state. We also know that there's a very clear state role defined in the statute, where once the EPA comes up with those targets, the states figure out how to get there and have quite broad latitude within the statutory language for making those choices. There's been a lot of discussion of the EPA's building blocks. The EPA's building blocks in the proposed rule originate from the language best system of emission reduction. So the EPA has to determine what the best system of emission reduction is, taking into account cost, taking into account other energy impacts, taking into account other non-air quality impacts, and that best system must be adequately demonstrated. So it has to be something that the EPA can point to that has either been demonstrated or deployed. That's how the EPA arrived at this building block. This is a building block approach that's the EPA characterizes as the best system, which is a combination of improving efficiency at coal-fired power plants, increasing dispatch from existing natural gas power plants, taking into consideration both nuclear units that are under construction and that may be at risk of shutting down, Also, zero carbon electricity coming from renewables combined with energy efficiency. So through that combination of those 4 building blocks here on this slide, we've divided up the zero carbon block into 3A and 3B, but really these are 4 building blocks in the proposal. That, using this formula, CO2 emissions from the existing fleet divided by megawatt hours of generation that's adjusted by the zero carbon generation and energy efficiency, that's how the EPA arrives at unique targets for each state, starting off with the existing fleet that the states have on the ground. Now, once the EPA identifies those targets, then the states, as I mentioned, have broad latitude. I have on this slide the statutory language. The performance standard reflects the degree of emission limitation achievable through the application of the best system of emission reduction. What this really means in plain language is that the states don't have to implement what the EPA defines as the best system of emission reductions. It means that the states have to get to the same level of emission reductions that would be achievable by that system. So the states have a lot of choices how to get there, and that's what's led to state officials really across the country engaging both within the state and with stakeholders and other states as well, trying to figure out what the implications of this are. Really a broad range of choices that could have very disparate impacts on the states depending on which options they choose. Now, anticipating the final rule. So, I think it's pretty clear that the final rule is going to look different than the proposal. The question is how, and the EPA is not really showing its cards at this point. But based on some of the comments that we have heard from EPA officials over the past 6 months, here are some big-ticket items that we think are likely to change. One, implementation timelines. There's been concerns raised about the interim targets in 2020. And how the interim targets in some states were stringent enough that it would require utilities to make a lot of choices, not by 2030, but by 2020, and that rapid timeline may be too costly and may prevent reliability concerns. That's likely to change. The specificity regarding compliance options. So, for example, if states want to engage in some type of multi-state interaction, what does that look like? If there's going to be multi-state trading, what are some of the aspects of multi-state trading? If there's going to be a rate-based approach, more specificity regarding how you incorporate the zero carbon generation from renewables or nuclear into an emissions rate for an existing fossil fuel-fired power plant. Likely to see a lot more specificity on those points. Potentially, each of the state targets will change, especially if the EPA changes the formula, so changes the building blocks for identifying the state targets. And we do know the EPA is going to propose a federal plan. So this would be the plan that would go into effect if the states choose not to submit a plan, or if the state's plans are insufficient. And a number of states are waiting to see what that looks like. If it's something that seems workable and would be in the best interest of the state, some states may choose to opt into that off the bat. What's likely to remain the same? Well, states are going to have emissions targets, and states are going to have a broad range of choices for deciding how to meet those emissions targets. And we also know that the other factors going to remain the same as the electricity sector really across the country is going to continue changing on this path that we're seeing right now. And there's a fair amount of uncertainty as far as technological options and as far as the price of future fuel prices, some uncertainty about the future of the nuclear fleet. So there's a fair amount of decisions that are up in the air at this point that the state officials are going to have to deal with, both on the utility commission side and on the environmental regulatory side. And the Clean Power Plan is layered on top of those existing challenges that are already underway. Now let me, one last slide. Just to point out, I think it's probably clear to everybody involved in this, this rule will be challenged in court. The challengers will seek a preliminary injunction, almost certainly, which is, that's what's necessary in order to delay the rule from going into effect until the court issues a final decision. Succeeding on a preliminary injunction request requires showing a number of factors, two of which are demonstrating a high likelihood that the challengers will be successful in the end, And then the other, and this is a particularly high bar, is demonstrating that there will be irreparable harm if the rule goes into effect or if the rule isn't delayed until the court issues a final decision. Because there's likely going to be a long implementation timeline for the Clean Power Plan, and at least under the proposal wouldn't go into effect until 2020. I think that in particular may be a high bar for the states and other challengers to achieve. But at the end of the day, the courts could either uphold the rule, overturn it, or overturn some parts and uphold other parts of the rule. We will know more about that once we see the final and once we see how the litigation proceeds. With that, I want to turn to my colleague Brian Murray to talk about some of the specific decision points for a Clean Power Plan compliance.
Thank you, Jonas. One of the things that we do at the Nichols Institute is try to provide objective economic analysis to guide some of the decisions that we've been talking about today. Last month, the Institute released 2 reports that featured some of the economic modeling that we performed on the Clean Power Plan. One of the reports looked at things from the national level with some detail down at the regional level, and the other report looked at the Southeast region with some detail down at the state level. I welcome you to come to our website and read those papers in detail. I won't be providing a summary of those in today's webinar, but I am going to focus on some key decisions that we were looking at the economic implications of in these reports. And the first one is the decision that states have, and the states have a number of important decisions, as Jonas indicated in his comments, about how to comply with the rule. And the first decision that we looked at is what the implications are of states choosing a rate or a mass-based standard. And they differ in fundamental ways. First of all, in terms of what the actual compliance, terms of compliance are under a rate and a mass-based system. Under a rate-based system, the regulated EGUs, and that's the acronym that we use for electric generating units or power plants, must meet the state rate goals that Jonas alluded to in the building block approach. Every state in the country has a different pound per megawatt hour goal that has been stipulated in the proposed rule. Now, those rates may change in the final rule, but they do differ on a state-by-state basis. And they vary based on the current mix of fossil generation and fossil emissions, and then the contribution of zero emissions generation, such as from renewable or nuclear. So compliance in a rate-based system, again, is to meet each of those rates, pure and simple, pounds per megawatt hour. However, the states do have the option to convert that to a mass-based system, where they take, instead of the compliance target being pounds per megawatt hour, there are tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. And in a mass-based compliance system, all that's required is that the regulated EGUs must have a sufficient number of credits or allowances that match their total emissions. So if you're a power plant that's generated 3 million tons of emissions over the course of a compliance period, you should have 3 million tons worth of credits or allowances to show to the regulator in order to be in compliance. Now, both of these types of systems allow for flexibility mechanisms in that the EGUs can exchange credits, and they would do so to save costs or to increase the profits of operations. So how credits are used. So in a rate-based system, an EGU with an internal emissions rate that exceeds the state target can use credits to lower their effective emissions rate down so that it meets the standard rate. So for instance, if a state has a target of 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour and an EGU is operating at 1,800 pounds per megawatt hour, they'll need to buy credits in order at sufficient quantity to bring their rate down to the 1,100 pound per megawatt hour target. In a mass-based system, the way credits are used is simply it's a one-for-one correspondence to all the emissions that are generated at the EGU. So that means that any credits that are necessary in order to meet their emissions quantity, in order to offset their emissions quantity, will be achieved through the purchase of credits from other units. So these systems then also differ in how these credits are generated. In a rate-based system, credits are generated by fossil units that are operating under the state rate target. So again, if you're at a state that has a target of 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour and you're running a unit at 800 pounds per megawatt hour, then every megawatt hour generated by that unit produces 300 pounds worth of credit that they can then trade or exchange with other entities who need them to meet compliance. In a mass-based system, these are typically handled through an allowance mechanism that's allocated at the beginning of the compliance period. Now, that can be done either for free, the allowances can be given for free to the EGUs, or they can be auctioned off, and there's different distributional consequences of that and different revenue consequences of that. So how credits are exchanged, once they've been issued into the market or once they've been generated by the firms, they can be bought and sold between regulated entities for the purposes of meeting compliance. And with enough operators in the market, that'll create a robust market, and there will be a market clearing price that indicates what the price of carbon is for an emitter. So it'll be whether it's $8 a ton or $15 a ton or $20 a ton, you can buy and sell credits in such a system for a market-determined price. And you will make your decisions about whether to be a buyer of credits or a seller of credits based on how much it's going to cost you to reduce your emissions relative to what the market price is. If it costs you more to reduce your emissions than the market price for a credit, you'll tend to choose to purchase these credits. If it costs less for you to reduce your emissions than the market price dictates, you'll tend to be a seller of those credits. Okay, so the rate and mass-based approaches may have a different effect on power prices. A mass-based system will generally raise power prices because every unit of emissions has a price put on it, and these emissions are paid for through the credit market, and that cost will be passed on to the consumers. By how much is passed on, it really depends on the relative stringency of the rule. In a rate-based system, you can actually have a situation where wholesale prices are lowered in some cases, and that's because, as indicated a minute ago, when you're generating electricity at below the emission standard, in essence, you're subsidizing the generation from that standard because you generate credits with every megawatt hour that's produced. And that can actually lower the prices on the margin, but it will not lower the cost of the system. So how this plays out in the retail price will depend on whether or not the state in question is a price-regulated state, and if so, how the utility commissions act to allow those prices to be passed on to consumers. So the next question we ask is, are mass-based systems more restrictive of load growth? So a mass-based cap, it's important to recognize, will limit the emissions, but it doesn't limit the load. It doesn't limit the amount of electricity that it can produce, just the amount of emissions that are generated from producing electricity. So it can handle load growth as long as the carbon intensity of that load declines. And then if new units are regulated outside the mass cap, and EPA is considering the possibility that new natural gas combined cycle units can either be regulated inside the cap or outside the cap. So regulated outside the cap, the fossil-based generation can grow by definition because that can be from the fossil units that are operating outside the cap. And it turns out that when EPA stipulated a mass-based equivalent for its rule, the version of the rule that would have new natural gas combined cycle units is a larger emissions limit than those without. So that the basic presumption there is that the new units that are expected to enter the market would be meeting the demands of the load growth that's expected. As for unexpected load shocks, a rate-based system may be able to accommodate them in the short run because it's based on a rate rather than a mass. But the trading and banking of credits in a mass-based system should help address any concerns there might be with the mass-based system handling unexpected load shocks. The second decision that the states will face is whether to comply within the state only or to engage in some sort of regional trading program. So in order to understand the appeal of a trading program that would operate at the regional level, let's go back to sort of a first principle example of why you would want to exchange credits to begin with. So imagine that you're in a state that has just 2 power plants. Now, there are states really operate with just this few, but it makes the example that much easier. The first plant can reduce its emissions by 1,000 tons at a cost of $20,000, so $20 a ton. Well, there's another plant who, because of the market conditions under which it's operating or the technology under which it's operating, can reduce those emissions for $10,000. And that's half as expensive, or $10 a ton, compared to plant one. So if you really wanted to reduce the cost of hitting an emissions target, you want to have plant two do the work in terms of this emissions reduction of 1,000 tons rather than plant one. The total cost of meeting that target will go down $10,000 if plant two does the reduction. So let's imagine a situation in which plant one, recognizing this, pays plant two a negotiated price of $14,000 to receive 1,000 credits. Now, plant one can use those 1,000 credits to meet its compliance obligation, and that will reduce its compliance cost by $6,000 because without this exchange of credits, they would have had to have paid $20,000 to reduce those tons. With the purchase of credits, they can just use those credits for compliance. On the flip side, plant two is going to profit by $4,000 because it only cost them $10,000 to reduce those emissions, but they receive $14,000 in revenue in order to do so. So both parties gain from this trade, and the total gain from trade there is the $10,000. Now, that's what happens when you have two parties in the market, but if you have many different buyers and sellers in the market, you can imagine these types of exchanges replicating themselves. And a market forms, and we get a market clearing price of, say, $14 a ton, as in this example. Now, the main point of that last example is to show you that the more traders that you have, or the more participants that you would have in this credit exchange, the more opportunity there are from gains from trade. So one of the things that we looked at in this report that I showed you earlier is what would be the implications of a state trying to comply just within its own borders versus trying to gain in a regional trading program with the other states in the region. And we looked in this report at just the Southeast region. And the take-home message from this is such. If you look at the figures that are in front of you right now, the bars on these figures represent the marginal cost of abating emissions down to the target for each of the states in the region. And as you'll see, the marginal cost of abatement across the region varies widely. Now, the bar that cuts across the middle shows what would happen if a regional market transpired. And what we would expect in a regional market is that one price would rule. So you would have states for whom the cost of mitigation is higher seeking to purchase credits from other states who can reduce their emissions costs on a lower basis. So you might expect to see Mississippi in the example to the left in a rate-based trading system wanting to buy credits from a state like South Carolina that can generate them more cheaply. The main point here is that when you set up a system, a trading system, you replace one in which costs vary all across the region to one in which the marginal cost is the same. And that's going to lower the overall compliance costs with the region and lower the overall economic burden of the rule. So from a state perspective, what are the gains from trade? Imagine you're a high-cost state. Well, if you're a high-cost state, then compared to acting alone, the allowance price for the region is going to be lower than if no interstate was allowed. The electric generating units will have a net compliance cost reduction because they can buy cheaper abatement in other states. The consumer's power prices may be lower because they're paying less for allowances. The power company that's selling them electricity is paying less for allowances. In low-cost states, the allowance price may be higher because than it would be if no interstate trading is allowed. Much like if you were in the state of Georgia and you're growing peaches, if you couldn't sell peaches outside the state of Georgia, the price of peaches would be pretty low. But people outside of Georgia, when they buy peaches, they're going to bid up the price of peaches in Georgia, raising the price for Georgia consumers, but reducing the price for the region overall. The electric generating units can be better off because they can sell the credits for more than it costs to abate them. So they can generate profits and rebate them to their customers if the State Utility Commission asks them to do so. And the consumer's power prices may rise depending on who sets the market price. and whether an EGU gains credit from sales that are rebated to the ratepayers. And one other form of value to low-cost states is the option value. So a low-cost state today may not necessarily be a low-cost state in the future. Choosing to participate in the market early on may allow them access to gains from trade that they would get if it turns out that there are lower cost mitigation opportunities elsewhere in the region. So one question that surfaces in this discussion is whether interstate trading will affect reliability. Jonah talked about reliability as being a key concern of the Clean Power Plan rule. And the main concern about it under the Clean Power Plan rule is that it may speed coal retirement, impacting the ability to meet baseload requirements as soon as 2020. Well, reliability is an issue with the electric power sector because of transmissions constraints and the inability to store power. But in an emissions market, it can help because there really are no transmissions constraints per se for emissions markets. They can trade seamlessly across borders and over time. But even with credit markets, there could still be reliability issues if there's not sufficient time to replace this capacity. That's why the wider the emissions market can help it more. Modeling shows that the mass-based standards, the existing units only, will delay retirement of coal relative to the rate-based approach. So a mass-based standard might be able to keep some of those coal units around a little bit longer through their purchase of credits from other lower generating sources. So if the state plans to allow trading, what is the state role in market design? That's the ultimate question here. So there are precedents out there right now, and that there are existing state-level carbon markets that occur in the Northeast region through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So there's 9 states that are engaged there in a mass-based emissions trading program in the electric power sector. And so the states have to decide essentially how compliance can be met within the state boundaries by using credits that are generated outside the state. And California, of course, has its own market that cuts across the economy, and not just the power sector, but other sectors of the economy that generate greenhouse gases. And this market is actually linked to the Canadian province of Quebec and the cap-and-trade program there. Now, there's an alternative to the Clean Power Plan approach that has been alluded to as common elements. And the common elements approach has the benefits of allowing interstate emissions credit trading, but without requiring states to develop a formal multi-state plan, something that could be administratively burdensome and difficult to pull off by the time the Clean Power Plan is supposed to be implemented. And the basic requirements of such a common elements approach is that each state must have a common definition of what a tradable unit is. So that might be, say, a ton of emissions. And that would be written into the individual state plan. However, they don't have to specify other states or which states trading can be allowed with, only that whatever is used within that state must meet that tradable unit definition. There's also, the states must stipulate that electric generating units can use these tradable compliance instruments to meet compliance. And there must be some sort of tracking system to ensure that no double counting is going on within the market or across the region. So that is the end of our prepared comments. We're open to questions right now, and I believe we've had some that have come online as we've been talking.
Yep, thanks, Brian. So this is Jonas. We have 2 questions so far. Let me just read the first, and we'll decide amongst us who's going to respond to each of these. Number 1, to what extent would the final rule include retirements spurred by MATS, that's the Mercury rule, and or economic forces? Is there any change in the final version that would make it easier for states to account for those?
Well, I would just say that in terms of MATS, we would be considered that. So if there's coal retirements, say, that are expected as a result of the MATS program, our presumption, at least in the economic modeling, is that those retirements will occur. So that would make any emissions reductions associated with that would certainly be sort of attributable, if you will, to the decline in emissions for each of the individual states. So that would presumably make meeting the emissions target that much easier, because those were, as long as those units were included in the 2012 inventory, those coal plants that are subject to retirement are part of the inventory and the emissions are being counted, then retiring those plants would work towards meeting the compliance requirements of the Clean Power Plan rule.
Yeah, I would just add that, the way I would consider is that the retirements are available as part of the compliance pathway for the states. If the state targets were based on historic emissions and EPA's assessment of how they could be lowered using the best system of emissions reduction, and the degree that the greenhouse gas emissions will drop because of those retirements, it'll help a state come into compliance. So.
Good. Well, so the second question, does EPA or the state implementation plans identify specific emissions rates for each EGU, or electric generating unit, or is it a generic rate for each state? I can start off with that. So what the EPA identifies is a rate for the state as a whole, and then it's up to each state to decide how to comply with that target that the EPA gives to the state. So states would have the choice to assign emissions rates for each power plant, or the state could also choose to take on some of the obligation by the state itself, for example, by implementing an energy efficiency program and demonstrating that that would achieve some level of emission reductions, and then allocating the remainder of the emissions target to states. So that's one of many choices that the states will have available to them once they see what the final rule looks like. We move on to, we have a couple of other questions that have come in. I think we can probably tackle this one pretty easily. Why do state goals vary so much in the proposal?
I'll take a crack at that. I mean, essentially, the state goals each reflect two things. One is what the emissions profile is of that state in 2012. And secondly, what are the opportunities to engage in those four building blocks that Jonas alluded to earlier? So what is their ability to reduce the emissions intensity of the coal plants that are operating within the state? What is the ability of the states to move from coal generation to natural gas generation within the state? And what is the ability of the state to undertake energy efficiency programs and renewable energy programs that will, when counted in the rate calculation, all lower the rate towards its compliance target? So that's what Jonas alluded to is the best system of emissions reductions. It's the EPA's assessment of what each state can achieve and taking somewhat of an equal burden across states.
Yeah, I would just use it as an example. I won't name particular states, but you can see the variety. If there's a state that's 90x% coal, so such that it does not have very much capacity in natural gas with which to change dispatch, you'll find that the EPA's algorithm will give it a lesser reduction target because it has less options, has less within the best system of emission reductions to access to make the reduction, as opposed to another state that has more ability to switch its dispatch between the two. You'll find that the EPA algorithm will ask it to do that and get to a lower target rate. Last thing I would say is that this is certainly a question that is going to be the first thing that every state official and every stakeholder pages to in the final rule to see how much of an adjustment was made in these formulas and algorithms based on the reams of comments that came into the agency.
Another question that we received is, you mentioned the common elements approach to complying with this rule. Can you describe in more detail how exactly that could work? What are the pros and what are the cons? Jonas, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So first off, this idea that we're referring to as common elements, what I think is really notable about this is it describes a concept that has kind of emerged organically from a number of groups that are working at the state level, pretty much all really at the same time. A lot of those conversations, even though states are different politically and have different energy mixes, are really starting to focus in on some of these potential barriers to market-based compliance and trying to think about creative solutions that would be available under the proposal to address them. So the common elements idea, what Brian describes and what we describe in a policy brief, really lays out what we think are the kind of core elements that would be necessary to allow trading to take place if the electric power producers decided that was in their best interest, and that would lead to lower overall compliance costs. And that's where the elements Brian talked about. You have a common definition of a tradable instrument, so tons of CO2 if that's the way that the state chooses to go, and a tracking system for making sure that those tradable units are good and meet the compliance obligations. There are other choices that states could make, right? So states may care where those credits are coming from, what states they're coming from. They may want reciprocity. So if a state accepts credits from another state, they may want that state to also accept credits from the original state. And I will note that there are a number of other organizations, as I mentioned, that have not only been thinking about this, but have published papers on it. The Great Plains Institute, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Georgetown Climate Center, all have papers exploring these ideas. They use somewhat different terminology, maybe market-ready or opt-in approaches, but exploring similar concepts and some of the different ways that this could work. And again, this is one of the points to look for in the final rule, whether the EPA takes these kinds of ideas on directly and provides some more guidance about how you could allow this kind of bottom-up trading program to emerge.
Great. We have another question here. Let me relay it. Do states like Virginia, which has considered legislation to join RGGI, stand to benefit from existing carbon markets? Can you provide examples about how state revenues can increase cost effectiveness of compliance?
I'll take that one on. Well, certainly, certainly RGGI can benefit from, Virginia could benefit from joining RGGI because it would provide the type of gains from trade that we talked about earlier. Now, how much they gain will really depend on an assessment of what their costs of meeting their target are relative to the RGGI states. If it's more expensive for them to hit their target than other RGGI states, then they'll certainly benefit from the lower cost mitigation they'll be able to buy from RGGI states, if that's the way it turns out. I haven't done a direct study of Virginia versus RGGI to know whether or not that's the case, but that's how that would play out if it were. As for revenue generation, so what and whether or not that provides opportunities for cost-effective compliance, I will actually use the RGGI states as an example. So the RGGI program has been in place for 6 years now, which they've generated a substantial amount of revenue through the auction program in RGGI. So all of the RGGI states initially get their allowances into the market by holding an auction. And the revenues from those auctions have been used for a variety of programs focused on energy efficiency and other low-carbon technology adoption, as well as being used to finance some of the renewable energy standards that occur within the state. So each of those have all contributed to making emissions reductions in the RGGI region a lot more cost-effective than they would be otherwise. The RGGI region has dropped emissions almost 40% since the program started in the late part of the last decade. Now, certainly not all of that is necessarily due to the power of the RGGI program. Much of it is also due to the role that shale gas has played, leading to switch from coal to natural gas. But it has played a substantial role. There's another question in here. Tim, I think I'm going to direct this at you. The D.C. Circuit Court just found that the challenges to the proposed rule were premature. What do you think that the court will say if new challenges are brought again once the rule is final?
First, if I knew the definitive answer to that, I probably could get rich in some way. I think there's first, I think the decision the D.C. Circuit just came down with that this was premature. was not surprising in the least. It was against all precedent for the court to intervene in a rulemaking at proposal stage, and I think the judges in that case said as much. In terms of the challenges that are coming down or forecasts that happen to the rule the moment it goes final, there is a lot, because there's so little precedent under Section 111D, and because there's so little, such little track record, it is both, both provides the agency with a great deal of flexibility because it's not bound by previous precedents, but also provides some legal uncertainty that we are all feeling. My personal opinion is that most of the challenges that would come under the Chevron deference to the agency, given the lack of alternative precedents, the agency should be granted Chevron deference. So some of the challenges that come down on the ambiguous language regarding the way that 111D is triggered and where there's conflicting language in the statute seem to fall within Chevron, and the agency's done very well in the Clean Air Act under Chevron deference in recent years. Some of the other issues that might come up about the definition of system of emissions reductions and how that was calculated, may have some more merit, but that really won't be decided until the judges render their opinion. Jonas, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't think so. I think the question that was before the D.C. Circuit that was determined to be premature was a question about whether the EPA, under the statute, really has the authority to engage in this rulemaking at all. And that's because of a distinction between a version of the law that passed the House of Representatives and a version of the law that passed the Senate that was never reconciled. And the EPA is taking that language, saying that there's some ambiguity and that the two provisions conflict with one another, and that the EPA should therefore be able to resolve that ambiguity. So that's going to be one of the threshold questions that the court hears, but the decision that just came out really gave no indication about where the court's going to come down on that particular question.
Yep.
Let me read a final question that we have here, and it gets back to the mass-based versus rate-based approaches and the distinctions between them. So I think probably we'll turn to Brian to start us off on this question. So between mass-based and rate-based approaches, what makes the most sense for states and why?
Okay. Well, I think I'll start by saying what makes the most sense for states is going to be determined a lot by what the final rule looks like. If EPA still stipulates that there's a certain rate that they can meet to be compliant and there's a certain mass-based target, I'm sure that states will take a look and presumably try to figure out what will be the easier lift for them. That issue aside, if you sort of look at the fundamental elements of it, a mass-based system, our economic modeling shows that it's a lower cost way to achieve the same level of emission reductions because in essence it gives you more flexibility. A rate-based system sort of has that certain requirements, in essence, if you will, to put renewables and energy efficiency into the denominator, which may very well be a cost-effective approach, but that could be achieved within a mass-based system as well. So it sort of constrains you more to try to achieve it with specific targets in the denominator. And when I say specific targets, I don't mean that you have to hit a specific target in order to meet the rate-based requirement. It will just be substantially easier to meet your rate-based requirement if you have a certain level of renewable energy and energy efficiency in there. Again, those options are available to you in a mass-based system, but you have other options available to you as well. And then I think it would be stating the obvious to say that the complexity level is a good bit lower in a mass-based system. Essentially there you just have a ton of emissions, there has to be a credit or an allowance that corresponds to every 10 of emissions coming out of the smokestack. There's plenty of precedent in that, both in terms of in the United States, in terms of the RGGI program and California program, as well as many other emissions trading systems for greenhouse gases throughout the world, and emissions trading systems within the United States for other pollutants like SO2 or NOx.
Okay, good. Thanks, Brian. Well, we have not received any other questions. We have just a few more minutes left scheduled for this webinar. I thought maybe we could turn now from questions to highlighting a few of the key points to look for in the final rule. Recognizing that with well over 3 million comments, just the response to the comments is likely to be in the thousands of pages. And since the EPA was starting with a blank sheet of paper with the proposal, in response to those comments, not only will the EPA need to describe what it is that it's doing, but will almost certainly make some substantive changes, as we refer to at the top of this webinar. So some of the key points that we think, as soon as all of us receive the final version at the same time, potentially sometime in August, here are the points that we're going to be looking for right off the bat. First off, final emissions targets. Obviously, this is going to drive a lot of the decision-making at the state level. Did the EPA change the formula for arriving at those emissions targets, and if so, how? So essentially, did the EPA alter the way that it defined the best system of emission reductions? The interim state emissions targets. I referenced this in my comments. This is how much needs to occur by 2020 as opposed to how much needs to take place by the end of the compliance period in 2030. The speed at which the utilities have to make these changes will inform the choices that they're going to be making. The treatment of new natural gas units, whether states have the option to include new natural gas as part of the Clean Power Plan, which, with Section 111D of the statute focuses on the existing power fleet, whether or not new natural gas units, which of course are being built really across the country, whether the emissions from those natural gas units are included in the overall Clean Power Plan or not, is also going to have a lot to do with how the state and how the utilities and electric power providers within the state comply, and whether the EPA provides some guidance for including new natural gas, whether the states provide the option for, whether the Clean Power Plan provides the option for states to include new natural gas, and if so, what are the implications? All that's going to be quite critical as the Clean Power Plan moves from issuing the final rule by the EPA to the states figuring out how to implement the obligations under the final Clean Power Plan. The treatment of under construction nuclear units. This is a particularly important question for states like South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee, which as of 2012, which was the baseline year the EPA used for designing the Clean Power Plan, all had nuclear units under construction. To the extent that those units are included in the state target, results in lower state targets because that's a lot of new electrons that are going to be coming onto the system. If that's included in the state target, then that obviously affects state choices, as opposed to if the state targets only pay attention to fossil generation or existing nuclear power plants and let states treat the under construction nuclear as part of a compliance strategy, knowing that when they come online, that may displace fossil. We don't include that in the target. That's going to have a lot to do with how the states react to the final rule. The formula for the rate to mass conversion. So Brian just spoke some about the implications of going with a rate-based approach versus the mass-based approach. In the original proposal, the EPA noted that it's possible to do this, but didn't include specific information about how to do so, provided some detail about that later in the fall. But again, was seeking comment on that. To the extent that the EPA is specific as far as the rate to mass conversion, or whether the EPA leaves the states a few options for deciding how to do so, that may impact whether states make similar choices or whether you see different conversion rates at different states. The proposed federal power plan, I believe that many stakeholders and state officials really are waiting to see what the EPA does here for a few reasons. First, the federal plan could potentially be so unattractive that it motivates states to develop their own plans. Conversely, the federal plan may actually be something that states, after they evaluate it, decide that it could be in the state's best interest just to accept the federal plan and therefore opt into it as opposed to having it imposed upon them. And then finally on our list here for points to look for, certainly this is not a comprehensive list of important points, but some of the key issues that we're going to be looking for as we take our first cut at the final rule is guidance regarding multi-state options. So you heard some discussion here about what we're calling common elements, but some of these options for states to facilitate trading without necessarily being engaged in explicitly designing markets. To the extent that the EPA speaks to what trading programs look like, what may trade, for example, under a rate-based system, defining what tradable instruments look like, defining the criteria that the EPA will look for some type of multi-state market interaction, the more specificity that the EPA includes in the final rule, the more that may streamline those options as compliance choices that the states may choose. So again, all of these open questions, but important questions that will inform what the state responses to the final rule look like. So with that, that's the end of our slide presentation here. I don't believe we have any more questions. So I guess on behalf of everybody here at the Nichols Institute, thank you for your time. And our contact information is available on the Nichols Institute website, nicholas-institute.duke.edu, as are numerous papers that we've been producing over the past 6 years we've been engaged in this process. So we welcome you to visit the website. We welcome feedback and look forward to interacting with you at a later date. Thank you.